It was Mother's Day. My son-in-law screamed at me in front of 12 grandchildren. "Old woman, nobody invited you. You don't get to eat for free in my house." I am Sarah, 72 years old, retired baker. And I knew with absolute certainty that he was going to choke on those words the second he read the piece of paper I had brought him. The silence that dropped over the large backyard was so heavy you could practically scrape it off your skin. The clinking of silverware against porcelain stopped dead. The smoke from the grill, which a second ago smelled like celebration and family, suddenly felt like it was suffocating us. My 12 grandchildren, from the oldest 19-year-old Matthew down to the tiniest 3-year-old girl playing with a dinner roll, glued their eyes to the red brick patio. Nobody dared to take a breath. My daughter Laura, the mother of 4 of those kids, and the wife of the man who had just insulted me, pressed her lips together and dropped her head. She hunched her shoulders as if the shout had been a physical blow to her spine. I just sat there. I remained at the head of the long wooden table, a table I had bought with my own money over 30 years ago, paid for by thousands of cakes sold at dawn. I watched Frank, my son-in-law. He stood in front of the grill, a can of beer in one hand and a pair of meat tongs in the other. His chest was puffed out, his face flushed from the heat of the charcoal and the alcohol he'd been throwing back since 10 in the morning. He looked at me with that cheap, hollow arrogance of men who need to humiliate an old woman just to feel like they own something. In that moment, he thought he was the king of the world. He thought the patience I had shown over the last decade was weakness. He thought my silence was fear. He didn't know that women like me, women who have spent their entire lives kneading dough at 4 in the morning in front of a commercial brick oven just to keep a family afloat. We don't know what fear is. We know exhaustion. We know sacrifice. But fear? Fear gets burned out of our hands along with the first scars of the trade. For a second, my mind traveled back looking for the root of this absolute insolence. I am a woman from the heartland, born and raised in a town where the summers are brutal and the people speak their minds. I was the owner of the Golden Wheat Bakery, a modest but thriving little shop that let me raise my 3 daughters single-handedly after my husband left me a widow at 40. I worked from before sunrise until long after dark. My hands, now spotted with age and thick at the knuckles, are the topographical map of my struggle. With these hands, I bought this corner lot. With these hands, I paid for every brick, every wooden beam, every shingle on the roof of this sprawling house with its wide hallways and the massive oak tree right in the center of the yard. 10 years ago, when Frank lost his corporate job in the city and drowned himself in debt, they came to me looking for a lifeline. Laura was crying, holding 3 little ones, with another on the way. Like any mother would, I opened the doors of my home. I gave them the main house and moved myself into a small in-law suite I had built at the back of the property, a humble 2-room space where I set up my old baking racks and my bed. I did it out of love. I did it to give them space, to not be a burden. But Frank confused my generosity with his own manifest destiny. Little by little, he started acting like the lord of the manor. First, he changed the lock on the main gate and handed me a spare key with a sigh, like it was an inconvenience. Then he started parking his heavy-duty truck right in front of my window, blocking out my morning light. Later, he started referring to the property as his house whenever the neighbors were in earshot. I listened, and I kept my mouth shut. I kept quiet because I saw the profound sadness in my daughter's eyes. Laura was a woman who had slowly dimmed while standing next to a mediocre man who compensated for his failures by raising his voice. I kept quiet for my grandchildren, so they wouldn't have to grow up in a literal war zone. But on that Sunday on Mother's Day, my well of patience finally ran dry. The excuse for his explosion had been entirely pathetic. I had walked out to the patio at noon carrying a 4-layer vanilla butter cake I'd been baking since the early hours, frosted thick with cinnamon buttercream. My other 2 daughters were already there with their families. We had pushed several tables together to fit all 12 grandkids and the adults. Out of habit, I sat at the head of the table in the carved wooden chair that had always been mine. Frank saw me sitting there, marched over with a scowl, and told me under his breath to move. He said that was his seat because he was the man of the house and the one working the grill. I looked him dead in the eyes with the exact same calm I used to watch yeast dough rise. And I told him I was perfectly comfortable and wouldn't be moving an inch. That was when he snapped. He slammed the metal tongs against the grill and let out the scream that froze the afternoon. "Old woman, nobody invited you. You don't get to eat for free in my house." The words hung suspended in the humid afternoon air. Eat for free, my house. I felt a fire rising in the back of my throat, but it wasn't shame. It was pure, crystalline indignation. I looked at the scene playing out in front of me. My daughters were actively avoiding my gaze. My younger sons-in-law, the husbands of my other 2 girls, were staring intensely at their own shoes. Uncomfortable, sure, but ultimately cowards, terrified to contradict the alpha male of the afternoon. The only one who looked ready to snap was Matthew, my oldest grandson, Laura's boy. I saw his fists clench under the table. I saw his muscles tense as he prepared to stand up. I stopped him with a single look, a severe, grandmotherly look that doesn't require a single syllable to deliver an order. He understood. He loosened his shoulders, but his eyes were shining with tears of absolute rage. I was not going to let my grandson get into a fistfight with his father to defend me. Dignity is not reclaimed with screaming matches or bloody knuckles. Dignity is imposed through action. I took my time. I placed my rough hands flat against the surface of the table. I felt the grain of the wood beneath my fingertips. I stood up painfully slow, smoothing out the dark linen skirt I had chosen to wear for the occasion. The silence was so absolute, you could hear the hiss of meat grease dripping onto the glowing charcoal. Frank held my gaze with a crooked, triumphant little smirk. He was waiting for me to cry. He was waiting for me to get up and run back to my little room at the back of the yard like a frightened stray dog. He expected the reaction of a poor, humiliated old woman. I started walking. But I didn't head for the gate, and I didn't head for my suite. I started walking around the perimeter of the long table. I went to Matthew first. I placed both my hands on his young cheeks. I leaned down and gave him a slow, deliberate kiss on the forehead. I could feel the heat radiating off his skin and the rigid tension in his jaw. Then I moved to the next chair, where my granddaughter Chloe was sitting. I stroked her curly hair and left a kiss on the crown of her head. One by one, I walked to all 12 seats. To every single grandchild, I gave a soft smile and a kiss heavy with love and heavy with farewell to the era of submission. The little ones hugged me around the waist, confused by the suffocating tension in the air, but comforted by my scent of vanilla and toasted flour. The older ones looked at me with a complicated mix of sorrow and awe. I didn't speak a single word during this procession. The only sound in the yard was my steady footsteps on the red bricks and the held breath of every adult at the table. When I finished kissing the very last grandchild, I reached the far end of the table where I had left my bag. It wasn't some elegant designer purse. It was a heavy canvas tote bag I had embroidered with yellow flowers years ago. Tough, practical, resistant. Just like me. I opened it with measured, unhurried movements. My daughters were watching me, completely mystified. Laura finally looked up. Her eyes were glassy. She tried to say something. She stammered out a weak, "Mom, please." But I just raised one hand to silence her. This was not the time for late apologies. The damage was done, and the cure was going to be surgical. I reached into the canvas bag. My fingers brushed past my old coin purse, a pack of peppermint lifesavers, and finally found the smooth texture of heavy stock paper. I pulled out a thick manila envelope tied with a figure-8 string. I turned to face Frank. He was still standing by the grill, but his mocking smile had started to slip. My reaction wasn't fitting the script he had written in his head, and my absolute tranquility was unnerving him. He took a long pull from his beer, desperately trying to maintain his posture of superiority. I walked toward him. The distance between the table and the grill was maybe 5 steps, but each one echoed in my chest like a kick drum. When I stopped right in front of him, the smell of cheap beer and nervous sweat hit my face, mixed with the charcoal smoke. I looked him up and down. There was not an ounce of resentment in my eyes, only the cold, clinical detachment of someone looking at a nuisance insect right before sweeping it off the porch. I held out my hand and offered him the envelope. He looked at it, his brow furrowing. "What is this, Sarah?" he asked. His voice didn't have that booming, strident volume anymore. There was a slight, undeniable tremor of doubt vibrating underneath his words. "Open it," I said. My voice came out strong, clear, ringing across the patio with the undeniable authority of a matriarch reclaiming her throne. Frank set the metal tongs on the edge of the grill. He wiped his right hand on his grease-stained apron, took the envelope, and untied the string with clumsy fingers. His hands, thick and entirely unaccustomed to fine detail work, pulled at the paper until he slid the contents out. It was a stack of 3 stapled pages. Right at the top on the letterhead was the official seal of the county recorder's office, right next to the blue ink signature of Arthur, my longtime estate attorney. Frank started reading. His eyes scanned the first few lines. I watched his Adam's apple bob up and down as he swallowed hard. The first page was a certified, freshly updated copy of the property deed. It was a document that proved beyond any shadow of a legal doubt that the entire lot, the main house, the in-law suite, the backyard, and the very dirt beneath the oak tree was registered solely to Sarah, a widow of sound mind and the absolute owner. He had always believed, because his own staggering arrogance had convinced him of it, that by moving in and taking over the water and electric bills, he had somehow acquired squatters' rights or equity. He thought that because I was old and tucked away in the back of the lot, I had essentially signed the property over to his wife as a living inheritance. He never bothered to investigate the actual legality of his cardboard empire. But that wasn't the worst part. The thing that drained every drop of blood from Frank's face was on the second page. It was a formal legal notice drafted by Arthur's law firm, a legally binding eviction mandate, a document that bore my signature at the very bottom, written in clear, looping cursive. It informed Mr. Frank that he had a peremptory grace period of exactly 30 calendar days to entirely vacate the premises, remove his personal belongings, and surrender the keys. It explicitly stated that failure to comply would result in immediate judicial removal, enforced by the county sheriff's department. The silence in the yard shifted from uncomfortable to utterly electric. Laura stood up, terrified by the sudden ghostly pallor of her husband's face. "What's going on, Frank? What is that?" she asked, taking a hesitant step toward us. He didn't answer her. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on the paper, rereading the eviction paragraph over and over as if it were written in ancient Greek. The beer can slipped out of his left hand and hit the brick patio with a sharp metallic crack. Golden foam washed over the toes of his shoes, but he didn't even flinch. I looked down at his hands. Those exact same hands that minutes ago were wielding the barbecue tongs like a scepter of absolute power were now holding a few sheets of paper with a pathetic, fragile weakness. The edges of the pages were vibrating. Frank was shaking. It was an uncontrollable tremor that started in his wrists and shot all the way up his arms. "It seems there was a mix-up with the invitations today," I said, raising my voice just enough so that every single person in that yard could hear me with perfect clarity. "You told me I was coming to eat for free in your house. That paper in your hands clears up exactly who owns the roof over your head, who owns the ground you are standing on, and it is serving notice that your time living for free in my house has come to an end." I didn't wait for a response. I turned on my heel, keeping my spine perfectly straight and my chin held high. I walked back to the table. My daughters were staring at me with their eyes wide open like they were looking at a ghost, or rather looking at the formidable woman who had raised them, a woman they thought had died a long time ago. I picked up my embroidered canvas bag, hooked it over my forearm, and started walking down the side path that led to the front gate. I was leaving the food behind. I was leaving the cake behind. I was leaving the barbecue smoke behind. But more importantly, I was leaving behind 10 years of condescension and silent humiliation. As I pushed the heavy metal gate open and stepped out onto the sun-baked sidewalk, I knew the war was just beginning. But I had won the very first battle without raising my voice a single decibel. The sound of the paper trembling in my son-in-law's hands was the only music I needed to celebrate my true Mother's Day. I walked down the uneven concrete sidewalk with a lightness in my step I hadn't felt in at least 2 decades. The 3 o'clock sun was hitting me dead in the face, baking the dark linen of my skirt, but I didn't care about the heat. Behind me, I had left the grill smoke, the smell of spilled beer, and the sepulchral silence of an entire family paralyzed by their fear of a dime store tyrant. Every step I took away from my own house was paradoxically a step back toward myself. The neighborhood streets were quiet. It was Mother's Day, which meant most people were tucked away in their own backyards, celebrating, faking happiness, or silently enduring their own franks. I turned the corner onto Main Street and walked 5 blocks until I hit the town square. I sought refuge in a classic little coffee shop called the Corner Roast. It had pale green walls, and the smell of freshly roasted beans always managed to steady my nerves. The place was practically empty. I picked a small table right by the window where I could watch the few people walking by. A young kid in a spotless apron walked over to take my order. He spoke to me, slowly dragging out his vowels, speaking entirely too loud, using that sickly sweet, condescending tone young folks usually reserve for toddlers and the elderly. He asked me if I wanted a nice cup of warm water to go with some chamomile tea, because surely black coffee would be much too harsh on my stomach at my age. I looked him right in the eye, gave him a polite but completely unyielding smile, and told him I wanted a large black coffee, dark roast, no sugar, and a glass of sparkling water with ice. The kid blinked, clearly taken aback by the gravel and iron in my voice. He nodded quickly and retreated to the counter. While I waited, I opened my old canvas bag. I reached in and pulled out my silver transistor radio. It was a heavy, durable little machine with a massive dent on the left side, a souvenir from 1998 when a 100-pound sack of flour fell off a shelf and crushed it. Despite the dent, it still worked flawlessly. For 30 years, that little metal box was my only companion during the dead-silent 3 a.m. baking shifts when the whole world was asleep and it was just me against the dough. I clicked it on, turned the dial down to a whisper, and found an AM news station. The soft crackle of static and the deep voice of the broadcaster immediately centered me. That little interaction with the barista got me thinking about something I had been quietly observing for years. When a woman turns 60, society throws an invisible blanket over her. We stop being people with character, with history, with sharp intellects, and we just become the sweet little grandma. They strip us of our names and slap a label on us. People assume our minds slow down at the exact same rate our knees do. They think white hair is a symptom of terminal naivety. They assume that if we are walking slowly, it's because we don't know where we're going. Frank made that exact same mistake. For an entire decade, he looked at me sitting in my rocking chair in front of the in-law suite, knitting occasionally or reading the Sunday paper, and he decided I was just another piece of furniture on the property. He thought my silence in the face of his disrespect was a lack of spine. He never understood that women who build businesses from the dirt up, women who raise daughters alone, women who know the exact weight and value of every single penny that crosses their threshold, we don't stay quiet out of stupidity. We stay quiet because we are assessing the board. We stay quiet because we know that patience is the sharpest weapon in the armory. My invisibility was my absolute best shield, and his arrogance was his fatal trap. The kid came back with my black coffee. Dark steam was spiraling off the rim. I took a sip. The bitter, acidic bite woke up every sense in my body. It was time to organize my assets. The bomb had already gone off in my backyard, but the real ground war was starting tomorrow at dawn. I reached back into my tote bag and pulled out a black, leather-bound ledger. It wasn't a diary. It wasn't a nostalgic scrapbook. It was my master accounting book. The cover was worn at the edges, and some of the pages had ancient stains of vanilla extract, but inside, the numbers were written in perfect, flawless blue ink columns. I flipped to page 42. There it was, the aggregate summary of my financial accounts. Frank always assumed my only source of income was a meager Social Security check. He thought I depended on him to keep the lights on and keep from starving. It literally never crossed his mind to wonder what I had done with the money from liquidating the commercial ovens, the industrial dough mixers, and the real estate when I sold the Golden Wheat Bakery 5 years ago. That money, the blood, sweat, and tears of decades of brutal manual labor, I didn't give it away and I didn't blow it. I put it all into fixed-term investment funds guided by Arthur, the very same attorney who drafted the eviction notice. I ran my index finger over the balances. I had enough liquid cash to pay a team of ruthless litigators for years if Frank decided to dig trenches and fight me in court. I had enough money to rent a luxury downtown condo tomorrow if I wanted to leave the house, but I wasn't going to do that. I paid for that house, brick by brick. Kneading dough at 3 in the morning with my hands covered in burn blisters from the oven racks. I wasn't going to surrender 1 square inch of my legacy to a man who only felt tall when he was stepping on someone else's neck. I turned to a blank page in the black ledger and started writing out my battle plan. The eviction was a legal process that took 30 days, but I wasn't going to sit in my back room waiting for him to pack his bags out of the goodness of his heart. I knew men exactly like my son-in-law, men with fragile egos and loud voices. His first reaction to reading that paper was undoubtedly denial. Next would come the rage. After that, he would try to use my daughter Laura and my grandkids as human shields to make me feel like a monster. I had to be 3 steps ahead. My first strategic move was obvious. Cut off his supply lines. Frank felt like the king of the castle because he had premium cable TV with the elite sports package to watch football all weekend. He had high-speed internet to play games on his phone. All of that, naturally, was in my name. He just tossed me a few crumpled bills at the end of the month to go pay the utilities, acting like he was doing me a massive favor. I pressed the pen hard into the paper. Monday, 8 a.m. Telecom office. I was going to cancel absolutely every single premium service. I would leave nothing but the basic landline. I wanted to see the look on his face when he turned on that massive flat-screen TV he bought on credit, only to be met with a dead black screen. Next, I thought about the core utilities, water and power. I couldn't cut off the water because of my grandkids, but I could march into the power company and request a technical step down of the electrical load limit on the smart meter to the absolute legal minimum. Goodbye to his 40-minute scalding hot showers. Goodbye to the central AC he kept blasting in his bedroom all day while I sweated it out in the back unit. I was going to reduce his standard of living to a pioneer baseline. If he wanted to live for free during his final 30 days on my property, he was going to live by my rules. The next item on my list was the most painful, but the most necessary. My daughter, Laura. Thinking about her sent a sharp ache through my chest. I remembered the way she hung her head when Frank screamed at me. I remembered the sheer terror in her eyes. And the truth was, I was partially to blame. By keeping my mouth shut for 10 years to avoid rocking the boat by retreating to the back of the yard to stay out of the way, I had taught my daughter that abuse is the acceptable price of family peace. I taught her that a woman has to shrink herself so her husband can feel big. I swallowed the lump in my throat and took another long sip of the black coffee. I could not let guilt soften my spine. Laura was going to cry. She would probably come knocking on my door tomorrow, begging me to withdraw the eviction notice, telling me Frank was sorry, that he was just stressed about money, that the kids needed their father under the same roof. I had to turn my heart to stone to survive her tears. A mother's love isn't always sweet like a vanilla buttercream cake. Sometimes it has to be bitter and shocking, like the black coffee I was drinking to wake up someone who is sleepwalking through life. I wrote a reminder in the ledger. Talk to Matt. My oldest grandson was 19, and today he had proven that he did not carry his father's cowardice in his DNA. I saw his fists clenched under the table. Matt was going to be my inside man in the main house. I needed to pull him aside, explain the stark reality of the situation, and tell him to keep his eyes wide open. I knew that Frank, in a fit of desperate rage, might try to sabotage the property, smash doors, rip out copper plumbing, destroy the garden. That would be my eyes and ears to ensure this man didn't destroy the inheritance that would one day belong to my grandchildren. Finally, I needed to secure my own perimeter. The in-law suite where I lived just had a standard wooden door and a flimsy old lock. I wrote the name of Bill's hardware store 4 blocks from my house in all caps in my ledger. First thing tomorrow, I was buying a heavy-duty, solid steel deadbolt, and I was going to install it myself. My hands still had more than enough grip strength to handle a drill and a screwdriver. I was not going to give Frank the opportunity to kick my door open in the middle of the night to intimidate me. The plan was taking shape, a clean, silent, lethal strategy. There would be no more shouting from me. There would be no dramatic arguments in the yard, just cold, concrete actions. With every single day that ticked down on that 30-day notice, Frank was going to feel the walls of the house he thought he owned closing in around his throat. I clicked off the transistor radio and slipped it back into my tote bag next to the black ledger. The sun had started to dip, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. Mother's Day was coming to an end. I paid the bill in cash, leaving a generous tip on the table for the condescending young barista. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt. I felt completely whole. For 10 years, I was a friendly ghost who baked cookies and swept leaves off the patio. I was the docile mother-in-law, the silent grandmother, the invisible woman. But the man who thought he could humiliate me in front of my own blood made the fatal error of waking up the owner of the house. And now he was going to find out that the owner doesn't fear the ashes because she spent her entire life working with fire. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I woke up at 4 in the morning out of pure muscle memory. A baker's internal clock never breaks, not even 5 years after turning off the commercial ovens for the last time. I got up in the pitch black of my suite, flipped on the yellow overhead light, and brewed my black coffee. While the water boiled in the enamel pot, I mentally reviewed the battle plan I'd written in my ledger. The clock was ticking, and Monday was just beginning. At exactly 7 in the morning, when the neighborhood was just starting to stir with the rumble of early commuter buses, I was already standing at the counter of Bill's Hardware. I bought a solid steel deadbolt, heavy and cold in my hand, along with a box of 3-inch reinforced screws. Bill, a guy with a gray mustache who had known me for 30 years, offered to send one of his teenage employees over to install it for me. I gave him a warm smile, but told him my hands hadn't forgotten how to hold a drill. I walked back to my suite and spent the next hour drilling through the wood and mounting the steel lock. The heavy metallic clack the bolt made as it slid perfectly into the strike plate was my first declaration of independence for the day. Nobody was crossing my threshold without my permission. At 9 in the morning, I caught a bus downtown. I walked into the telecom office, pulled a paper ticket, and waited patiently. When the girl at the counter called my number, she greeted me with that exaggerated, sugary customer service voice they use for seniors, probably assuming I was there to complain about a late fee or ask how to read my bill. I slid my ID across the counter and ordered the immediate permanent cancellation of the premium sports package and the high-speed broadband internet for the main house. The girl blinked rapidly, totally confused. She warned me I'd lose all my premium bundle discounts and asked if I was absolutely sure. I looked at her and said I had never been more sure of anything in my 72 years on Earth, and to leave nothing but the basic copper wire phone line active. I signed the work order with my looping cursive and walked out with the cancellation receipt tucked into my skirt pocket. My next stop was the power company. The bureaucracy there was a bit thicker, but my status as the sole unencumbered owner of the deed opened every door. I requested a technical step-down in the electrical load capacity for the main property's meter. The supervisor looked at me over the rim of his glasses and explained that, with the amperage reduced that low, if someone tried to run the central air conditioning and the electric water heater at the same time, the main breaker would trip instantly and kill the power to the house. I nodded, slowly, thanked him for the thorough technical explanation, and signed the authorization form. That was the exact trap I was setting. I got back to the house around noon. The sun was baking the patio, and the oak tree was casting a massive, generous shadow. The main house was dead quiet. The grandkids were at school, Laura was grocery shopping, and Frank was supposedly looking for work, though the whole neighborhood knew he spent his mornings betting on pool in the next town over. I locked myself in my suite, threw the new steel deadbolt, and turned my transistor radio on to a low murmur. Instead of knitting or watching soap operas, I pulled a cardboard box out from under my bed. Inside was my vintage collection of heavy tin baking pans, star molds, deep dish rounds, fluted bundt pans. I sat by the window with a clean rag and a jar of metal polish and started rubbing the tin until it shined like mirrors, waiting patiently for the sun to drop and my son-in-law to come home. At 6 o'clock, I heard the obnoxious roar of Frank's truck engine. He parked aggressively on the street. I heard the heavy metal gate slam shut. His heavy boots stomped down the walkway and into the main house. I kept polishing a cake tin without my breathing changing rhythm. 10 minutes later, the peace of the afternoon shattered. Through the glass of my window, I heard the first muffled shouts coming through the walls of the main house. Frank was roaring. I imagined him dropping onto the couch, clicking the remote to turn on his massive flat-screen TV to watch the sports highlights, only to be met with a bright blue screen demanding he contact his service provider. Next, he probably tried to connect his phone to the Wi-Fi to play his games, only to find the network had vanished into thin air. He didn't storm out to the yard to scream at me. The memory of that notarized eviction notice I handed him on Mother's Day was still burning a hole in his pocket. He knew that one wrong move, one direct threat toward me, and I could dial 911 and have the sheriff expedite his removal for harassment. So he took his rage out on the inanimate objects. I heard a door slam so hard the frame rattled. But the real test came an hour later. The evening heat was starting to feel thick and sticky. Frank, deeply loyal to his routine of a man who demands luxuries he doesn't pay for, turned on the central AC in the master bedroom. A few minutes later, he undoubtedly decided to take a steaming hot shower to soothe his stress. Suddenly, a loud, hollow pop echoed from the exterior wall of the main house. The main breaker had tripped. Every single light in the big house died instantly, plunging Frank, Laura, and my grandkids into pitch blackness. My in-law suite, which was wired on a completely separate low-draw circuit, stayed perfectly illuminated. My little oscillating fan kept spinning, and my transistor radio kept humming a classic blues tune. I smiled into the polished metal of my baking pan. The execution of my strategy was running with the flawless precision of a perfectly measured recipe. At 8 o'clock, I heard a soft, trembling knock on my door. It wasn't Frank's arrogant pounding. It was the knuckles of my daughter. I slid the steel bolt back and opened the door. Laura was standing there, bathed in the yellow porch light. Her eyes were swollen, her shoulders slumped, her hands twisted into knots over her stomach. She looked 10 years older than she actually was. I brought her inside and offered her the only wooden chair I had, right across from my bed. I stayed standing, leaning against the small desk where I kept my black ledger. "Mom, please." Laura started, her voice cracking in half. "Frank is furious. He says you called and cut off the internet and the cable, and now the power won't hold. The breaker trips every time we turn on the air. The kids are scared in the dark." I looked at her with all the agonizing love a mother can feel, but also with the iron resolve of a doctor who knows you have to scrub an infected wound down to the bone to save the limb, no matter how much the patient screams. "The kids can go out to the patio and catch the evening breeze, just like you did when you were little, Laura," I replied. My tone was perfectly level. I didn't raise my voice. "They can read a book by a desk lamp if you turn off the heavy appliances. But what I am absolutely not going to do is continue financing the luxury lifestyle of a man who disrespects me at my own dinner table." Laura buried her face in her hands and sobbed. I knew she was using my grandkids as a human shield, parroting the exact manipulative talking points Frank had injected into her brain 20 minutes prior. "Are you really going to throw us out on the street in 29 days, Mom?" she asked, looking up at me with desperate, pleading eyes. "He's the father of your grandchildren. Where are we supposed to go? We don't have the money for a security deposit." I walked over and put my hand on her shoulder. I could feel the rigid, terrified tension in her muscles, right through her blouse. "You and my grandchildren will never lack a roof over your heads. This house is as much yours as it is mine," I said, measuring out every single syllable. "But Frank's time on this property is over. He has 29 days to pack up his arrogance and find somewhere else to drop dead. If you decide to pack your bags and follow him out that door so you can keep your head bowed for the rest of your natural life, that is your choice. That will be your cross to bear, Laura, not mine. I already carried my cross working the graveyard shift to buy these bricks, and I am not going to let him grind them into dust. No, Laura didn't know what to say. She was so thoroughly conditioned to surrender the second her husband raised his voice that my cold, implacable tranquility completely disarmed her. She sat in my room and cried for a while longer. I gave her a glass of sparkling water, which she drank in silence. When she finally ran out of tears, she stood up, gave me a cold, hollow kiss on the cheek, and walked back out into the darkness of the main house. It broke my heart to see her walk out like that, so thoroughly defeated by her own fear. But I knew it was a necessary amputation. You cannot cure the poison of submission with warm hugs. The next afternoon, Tuesday, I got a very different visitor. Matt, my oldest grandson, walked across the patio while his dad was out. He noticed the heavy steel deadbolt on my door and gave a slight, knowing smirk. I waved him inside. I pulled a massive slice of leftover vanilla butter cake out of my mini fridge, put it on a china plate, and we sat down to talk. Matt was 19, but the toxic environment inside that house had forced him to grow up way too fast. He had sharp, intelligent eyes and massive hands, just like my late husband. I laid out the legal reality for him with zero sugarcoating. I didn't insult his father. I didn't use degrading language. I just gave him the tactical facts, the deed, the notarized eviction mandate, and the hard 30-day deadline. Matt ate his cake in silence, nodding slowly at every sentence. He kicked a chair across the kitchen yesterday when the power died, Matt confessed, instinctively lowering his voice. He said that before he gets dragged out of here, he's going to rip the copper pipes out of the drywall and smash every window in the place. Said if the house isn't his, he's leaving it a pile of rubble. The threat didn't surprise me in the slightest. Cowards always attack inanimate objects when they realize they can no longer control the people around them. I took a sip of my black coffee and looked my grandson dead in the eye. That is exactly why I need you to be my eyes and ears inside that house, Matt, I said, placing my wrinkled hand over his large one. Your father is a cornered animal right now. He knows he lost his kingdom, but his ego won't let him process it. I need you to watch the property. If he picks up a hammer to smash a pipe or takes a crowbar to a doorframe, you text me immediately. I have the sheriff's dispatch on speed dial, and I will not hesitate for a single second to have him dragged off this property in handcuffs if he tries to destroy my legacy. Matt pressed his lips into a hard line and gave a firm, single nod. I'm not going to let him wreck your house, Grandma. I promise you that, he said. And I knew he meant it with every fiber of his being. In that moment, we locked in a silent alliance. Frank thought he commanded his family, but true loyalty is never forged by screaming. It is earned through respect. The following weeks devolved into a grueling psychological Cold War. Frank tried to break my nerve with petty, ridiculous stunts, the kind of things a toddler does when throwing a tantrum. One afternoon, he backed his massive truck all the way down the driveway, parking the rear bumper less than 2 inches from my door, completely blocking my exit. He sat in the house waiting for me to come out and yell, waiting for me to beg him to move it so he could feel a rush of power. Instead, I pulled out my black ledger, looked up the direct number for municipal parking enforcement, and called them from my landline. I reported an illegally parked vehicle blocking a residential fire exit on private property. The next morning, a county deputy slapped a bright yellow citation on Frank's windshield. He had to move the truck himself, cursing under his breath, absolutely terrified to make eye contact with me. Another Saturday morning, he tried to rattle me by rolling down his truck windows and blasting heavy metal music at an ear-splitting volume right outside my window. I didn't say a word. I walked out of my suite, perfectly calm, unrolled the heavy green garden hose, and started watering the oak tree. I strategically aimed the high-pressure nozzle so the morning breeze caught the spray, sending a relentless, heavy sheet of water directly into the open window of his cab. He had to dive across the soaked upholstery to roll the window up and kill the radio. I just kept watering my tree, humming along to the jazz on my transistor radio. Time was the ultimate weapon, and it was entirely on my side. Every time he tried to take a shower with the AC running, the house went pitch black, reminding him exactly who controlled the current. Every time he sat down to watch a game, the dead screen forced him to stare at his own pathetic reflection. His luxuries were evaporating one by one, and the space he considered his empire was shrinking around his neck like a hangman's noose. The month marched forward totally unforgiving. His arrogance was eroding into dust, and I hadn't raised my voice a single time. He was burning alive in the slow cooker of my patience, while the red X's on the calendar on my wall signaled his impending exile. Day 28 dawned with a heavy, bruised gray sky, the kind of oppressive, humid Midwestern morning that promises a violent thunderstorm that just refuses to break. The heat in the backyard was sticky and suffocating. But I had spent 40 years standing in front of commercial ovens. This was nothing to me. Sitting in my rocking chair in the deep shade of the oak tree, I watched the main house. The entire ecosystem of the property had mutated over the last 4 weeks. It was like watching a terrarium where someone had violently altered the climate. Frank was bearing the brunt of the changing seasons. His physical and mental deterioration was glaring. Without his central air, without his sports packages, without his high-speed internet to numb him to his own overwhelming mediocrity, he had been forced to actually live inside his own reality. And he clearly despised a neighborhood. He shuffled down the hallways, dragging his feet. He had a patchy, graying beard he hadn't shaved in days, and his eyes were permanently bloodshot. That booming, chest-thumping arrogance that possessed him to scream at me on Mother's Day had withered into a mute, cowardly resentment. He had tried a couple more dirty tricks in the final stretch, like leaving the outdoor spigots running on full blast to rack up my water bill, or tossing bags of trash right outside my door. But Matt, completely true to his word, would walk out, shut the water off, and sweep up the garbage before I even had to get out of my chair. My oldest grandson had morphed into a silent, impenetrable retaining wall between his father's pathetic tantrums and my absolute peace. That Thursday afternoon, the grandfather clock in my room hit 5 o'clock. The tension finally reached its boiling point. I was in my suite wiping down my old tin baking molds and listening to a blues program on my silver radio. Suddenly, a violent metallic crash rattled the glass in my window panes. I snapped the radio off. The noise came from the patio. I looked out and saw Frank violently kicking a wrought iron patio chair against the brick wall. He was gripping a half-zipped black canvas duffel bag in one hand. With the other, he was pointing a trembling finger at my daughter, Laura, who was standing by the kitchen door, weeping uncontrollably. "I told you to pack the damn kids, Laura!" Frank roared. His voice was raspy, shredded by his own rage. "I am not staying one more minute in this hellhole, waiting for your mother to call the cops on me. We are leaving, right now." Laura was shaking her head violently, trembling from head to toe. My youngest grandkids were pressed against the living room window, their eyes wide with sheer terror. "Frank, please, we don't have anywhere to go," my daughter begged, twisting her hands together in agony. "The kids are in the middle of the school semester. You can't ask me to drag them out onto the street. Just go talk to my mom. Apologize to her. I'm sure she'll—" "I am not apologizing to that old bitch." He cut her off, taking a highly aggressive step toward her. "You are my wife, and your job is to follow me. If you don't walk out that gate with me right now, I swear to God, you will never see a single dime from me again. Let's see how you feed these brats on your own." The kitchen timer had just gone off. The dough was fully proofed. It was time for the final bake. I slid the heavy steel deadbolt back. I stepped out onto the patio. My steps were slow, heavy, and completely unbothered. I smoothed down my linen skirt. I did not come out empty-handed. Tucked securely under my left arm was my black leather ledger, and balanced on top of it was a vintage royal blue tin box, the kind that used to hold Danish butter cookies, but which I had used for the last decade as a classified vault for my most sensitive financial documents. Hearing my hard soles click against the brick patio, Frank whipped around to face me. His eyes were leaking pure hatred, but underneath it there was a profound, undeniable terror that he was desperately trying to mask with volume. "Oh, here comes the queen of the castle," he screamed, throwing his arms out in a pathetic theatrical gesture. "Go ahead, Sarah. Call your cops. I'm leaving, but I'm taking my family with me, because they belong to me, not you." I stopped exactly 6 feet away from him. I didn't look at his duffel bag. I didn't look at his flushed, sweating face. I looked directly at Laura. My daughter's eyes were completely shattered. She was trapped in the agonizing purgatory between the fear of abandonment and the absolute panic of chaining herself to a man who was actively dragging her to the bottom of the ocean. "Laura," I said. My voice was soft, gentle, almost like I was speaking to the 10-year-old girl she used to be. "Go inside. Take the kids to their room and lock the door." "Nobody moves," Frank bellowed. He lunged forward and grabbed Laura roughly by the bicep. Before I could even shift my weight to intervene, a tall, broad shadow materialized between them. It was Matt. My grandson didn't utter a single syllable. He just reached out, clamped his massive hand around his father's wrist with brutal, bone-crushing force, his knuckles turning pure white from the pressure, and physically forced Frank to release his mother. Frank stared at his son, totally stunned by the raw, physical power of the boy. Matt shoved his father backward by the chest, drawing an invisible, impenetrable line in the concrete of the patio. "Mom, do what Grandma says. Go inside," Matt ordered. His voice didn't shake. It didn't crack. It was the voice of a grown man who had just unilaterally decided that the generational cycle of abuse in this family was dying today. Laura, sobbing hysterically, nodded. She turned and ran back into the main house, herding the little ones away from the blast zone. That left the three of us on the patio. Frank breathing heavily, his chest heaving. Matt standing tall with his fists balled tightly at his sides. And me calmly holding my black ledger and my cookie tin. Frank let out a bitter, psychotic little laugh, aggressively adjusting the collar of his shirt. "Real nice. The old woman turns the son against the father. You're a snake, Sarah. But I don't give a damn. I'm out of here. I'm taking my truck, and we'll see how you all rot in this old house without a real man to pay the bills." He reached down to grab his duffel bag, fully prepared to march out, making as much noise as humanly possible, casting himself as the ultimate victim of a terrible injustice. He genuinely believed that walking out the gate was going to be his final flex of power, his ultimate threat. "Not so fast, Frank," I said. I popped the lid off the metal cookie tin with a sharp clack. He froze in his tracks. He looked at me over his shoulder, his brow furrowed in suspicion. "The eviction deadline expires in 2 days. I continued setting the metal tin down on the wooden patio table, the exact same table where he had tried to strip me of my dignity weeks ago. "And you are entirely correct. It is time for you to leave. But before you walk out that gate and climb into your truck, we have some outstanding accounts to settle. You talk an awful lot about being the provider for this family, but it seems your memory, much like your manhood, is severely defective. I reached into the cookie tin and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of rectangular papers. They were tightly bound with a thick rubber band. I dropped them onto the wooden table. The heavy, flat smack of the paper hitting the wood seemed to echo across the entire neighborhood. "What kind of garbage is this now?" Frank asked. He took a hesitant, deeply paranoid step toward the table. "Step up and read them. You know how to read, don't you? You demonstrated excellent reading comprehension on Mother's Day." Frank hesitated, but the morbid curiosity and the creeping dread overpowered his ego. He walked up to the table and looked down at the stack. His face, which had been flushed beet red with fury just seconds ago, drained of all remaining color in the blink of an eye. His jaw actually went slack. They were promissory notes, payday loans, debt markers, 25 of them to be exact. "You always thought I spent my afternoons knitting and listening to music on my radio. You thought I was just a clueless, uneducated widow," I said. I opened my black leather ledger right to the page where I had meticulously mapped out his financial ruin. "For the last 5 years, Frank, you have been borrowing money from every loan shark downtown, from the neighborhood credit union, and even from the auto parts suppliers for your truck. Money that you blew on sports betting, on cheap liquor, and on trying to project a lifestyle you couldn't actually afford." He tried to speak, but the words literally got stuck in his windpipe. His eyes darted frantically from one promissory note to the next, recognizing his own sloppy, desperate blue ink signature on every single one. "What you didn't know," I continued, rolling every syllable around in my mouth with the slow, deliberate satisfaction of tasting fine honey, "is that the loan sharks in this town are not known for their patience. When you started defaulting, they came knocking on my gate. I answered the door while you were sleeping off your hangovers. And because I absolutely refused to let them break your legs in front of my grandchildren, or let them repossess the few appliances of value in this house, I had my attorney Arthur broker a deal with them. I bought your debt. I paid off every single penny in cold, hard cash using the reserves from my bakery. I am your sole creditor, Frank." I reached down and slid the top paper off the stack. It had the largest number printed on it. "This one specifically is the title loan you took out against your precious heavy-duty truck 3 years ago. That vehicle you're planning to use for your grand escape today? Legally, it belongs to me. If you add up the principal and the compound interest on all these papers, you owe me a figure you couldn't pay off if you worked 3 consecutive lifetimes scrubbing dishes." The silence that dropped over the patio was absolute. The only sound was the buzzing of a horsefly circling the cold grill and the ragged, shallow breathing of my son-in-law. Matt was staring at me, his eyes wide, completely blown away by the terrifying level of strategic preparation his grandmother had kept buried in a cookie tin for half a decade. Frank swallowed hard. It sounded like he was swallowing broken glass. His hands, the same hands that had violently shaken my daughter minutes ago, were trembling so violently he had to grip the edge of the wooden table just to keep his knees from buckling. The grand illusion of his superiority had just been shattered into a million pieces against the concrete. "Sarah, we can work something out," he stammered. His voice wasn't a roar anymore. It was the high-pitched, pathetic squeak of a mouse caught in a glue trap. "You know I don't have that kind of cash. You can't take the truck. It's my only tool to go out and look for work." I smiled, but there was zero joy in it. It was the smile of a general looking out over a battlefield after winning a war that never should have been fought. "You haven't looked for work in 10 years, Frank. You've looked for excuses. And no, we are not going to work something out. Because I do not negotiate with men who humiliate women at their own dinner tables. I snapped my black ledger shut and tucked it firmly under my arm. I stared right into his eyes without blinking. He broke eye contact almost instantly, completely incapable of bearing the crushing weight of his own profound shame. I am going to give you one single option. I dictated my voice, carrying the freezing detachment of a judge reading a life sentence. You are going to pick up that black duffel bag. You are going to walk to the gate. You are going to leave the keys to the truck and the keys to this house on this table. And you are going to walk out onto the street. You will never set foot on this sidewalk again. You will never raise your voice at my daughter again, and you will never claim a damn thing from this family again. In exchange, I will put these markers back in my tin box. I will not march down to the courthouse to garnish your non-existent wages, and I will not send you to a federal penitentiary for wire fraud. Consider the truck as retroactive payment for the 10 years of free rent, water, and electricity you consumed under my roof. Frank stood paralyzed. His eyes were glued to the blue cookie tin and the stack of papers that represented his absolute inescapable ruin. The air in the patio had gotten so thick it was hard to pull into your lungs, but to me, it was the purest oxygen I had breathed in a decade. I watched his chest rise and fall in rapid, panicked spasms. He searched my face for any trace of hesitation, any microscopic crack where he could wedge in his cheap emotional manipulation. The exact same tactics he had used to paralyze my daughter for years. But looking into my eyes, all he found was the hardened surface of a refractory brick. The kind of brick that sits directly in the fire and doesn't even crack. Slowly, as if his arms weighed 200 pounds each, Frank reached his right hand into the pocket of his faded jeans. He pulled out a heavy key ring. The metal jingled in the dead silence of the afternoon with a sharp, defeated ring. His thick, shaking fingers worked the metal loop, separating the electronic fob for the truck and the brass key to my front gate. He dropped them onto the carved wooden table. The sound of the metal hitting the wood was the final slam of the gavel. He didn't say another word. There was no more screaming, no more insults, no more threats about smashing the plumbing. His ego, that massive, inflated monster he had used to terrorize my family, had just been popped by the sharp edge of a notarized document. He bent down, picked up his black duffel bag, and started walking toward the side gate, dragging his feet like a broken old man. Matt and I watched him in total, unbroken silence. His heavy boots echoed hollowly against the concrete. When he reached the metal gate, he pushed it open, stepped out onto the public sidewalk, and pulled it shut behind him. The heavy clack of the latch locking into the frame was the perfect punctuation mark to end a decade of cowardice. In that exact instant, the bruised gray sky that had been threatening us all afternoon finally ripped open. A heavy, freezing, torrential downpour crashed over the patio. It washed over the red bricks, soaked the leaves of the oak tree, and instantly cleansed the yard of the suffocating toxic heat that man had left behind. Matt let out a massive, shuddering exhale like he'd been holding his breath since Mother's Day. He turned to me, looked down at the table, picked up the truck keys and placed them firmly in the palm of my hand. Then, without saying a word, he wrapped his massive arms around me in a crushing hug. I felt the raw power in his young arms. I felt the unbreakable loyalty of a boy who had consciously chosen respect over poisoned blood. I patted him firmly on the back, smelling the fresh rain on his t-shirt. "It's over, kid," I whispered. "The storm is outside now, not inside." I gathered up my stack of debt markers, locked them back inside the blue tin, and tucked it under my arm next to my ledger. We walked side by side into the main house. When I pushed the living room door open, the atmosphere inside was a tomb. The curtains were drawn tight, and the lights were dead because of the electrical restriction I had imposed. Laura was sitting on the frayed couch, clutching my youngest granddaughter to her chest, while the other two boys stared up at her from the rug with saucer-wide eyes. Laura's face was completely drenched in tears. She was bracing herself, waiting to hear Frank kick the door open and scream at them to get out on the street. I walked over to her slowly. I set my ledger and my tin box on the coffee table and sat down right next to her. I reached out and stroked her hair, pushing a damp lock away from her forehead. "He's gone, Laura," I said. My voice was incredibly gentle, but anchored in steel. "He left the keys. He is never coming back." My daughter looked at me with a chaotic collision of sheer terror and staggering relief. It was the terror of having her routine shattered, crashing head-on into the dizzying relief of sudden freedom. She collapsed against my shoulder, sobbing with a violent force that shook her entire ribcage. She cried for the lost years. She cried for the humiliations she had swallowed in silence. She cried for the deep-seated fear of being alone and for the crushing shame of having let a mediocre man dim her light for so long. I held her tight. I rested my chin on the top of her head, letting the thunderstorm rage outside, while she purged the poison from her system on the inside. "Cry every single tear you need to cry today, baby," I murmured into her ear. "Empty your chest completely. But listen to me very carefully. Starting tomorrow, nobody in this house sheds another tear over a man who doesn't know the absolute worth of the women standing next to him. Starting tomorrow, we rebuild." And we did. The transformation of our reality didn't happen overnight with a magic wand. It happened with the steady healing rhythm of dough rising in the perfect ambient heat. First thing the next morning, I marched back to the power company and the telecom office. I restored the amperage to the main breaker and ordered the high-speed internet turned back on. But this time, the utilities ran on my terms. I sat Laura and Matt down at the kitchen island and made it crystal clear this house was going to operate on the principle of shared responsibility. Laura was terrified. She hadn't worked a job outside the home in 15 years, and she had no earthly idea how she was going to feed her kids without the financial shadow Frank had pretended to cast. That afternoon, I walked back to my suite, packed up my heavy tin baking molds, and carried them into the kitchen of the main house. I dropped them onto the granite counter. I plugged in my silver transistor radio and tuned it to a station playing upbeat jazz, turning the volume up loud. "Roll up your sleeves, Laura," I ordered, tossing her a pristine white apron. "Fear doesn't pay the electric bill, work does. And you carry my blood in your veins. The women in this family know how to pull money out of flour dust." I started teaching her the exact secrets that had built the Golden Wheat Bakery. I taught her how to gauge the temperature of the dough using nothing but her fingertips. I taught her how to measure active yeast with her eyes closed. I taught her that patience is the single most expensive ingredient in any recipe. In the beginning, her hands shook. She burned a couple of trays of cookies. But as the weeks rolled on, I watched the heavy, knotted tension drain out of her shoulders. Baking became her physical therapy. Slamming the heavy dough against the granite counter became her outlet for a decade of repressed rage. Watching the bread rise and double in the oven restored her faith in her own ability to create something beautiful and sustaining. We started selling artisanal breads and custom cakes to the neighbors, and within a month, we secured contracts with 2 coffee shops downtown. The rich, heavy aroma of vanilla extract, cinnamon, and brown butter permanently erased the stale scent of cheap beer and suffocating fear that Frank had baked into the drywall. A month after my son-in-law walked out the gate, I bought a brand new ledger. It had a thick, crimson red cover, I handed it to Laura one night after dinner, along with a black ink pen. "This is yours," I told her, tapping the crisp, blank pages. "You are going to track every single penny that comes in from your sales and every single penny that goes out. A woman's self-love, Laura, starts with knowing exactly what her labor is worth on the open market. You don't ever rely on someone else's wallet to feed your kids. You never, ever hand the steering wheel of your life over to someone who refuses to respect you when you're standing on your own 2 feet." Laura took the red ledger with both hands. Her eyes had lost that dull, foggy opacity of a beaten-down woman. There was a fierce new light burning in them, a sharp determination that looked exactly like the one I found in the mirror when I became a widow at 40. She thanked me with a smile that reached all the way to her eyes, opened the book, and started drawing her first accounting columns. Matt, for his part, proved he was already a man in full. I tossed him the keys to Frank's heavy-duty truck. I didn't give it to him as an unearned gift. I gave it to him as a tool for commerce. I made it a strict condition that he use the vehicle to run his mother's bakery deliveries every morning and afternoon. With the truck, he also landed a solid job running building materials for Bill at the hardware store. Watching him back out of the driveway, checking his mirrors carefully, and giving me a sharp salute out the window, filled my chest with an overwhelming, towering pride. He had taken a sledgehammer to the chain of generational cowardice his father tried to forge. The news of exactly how Frank got exiled spread through the extended family like a brush fire. I never once bothered to explain myself or give my side of the story. I didn't have to. My other 2 daughters and their husbands received the message loud and clear. The power dynamic in the family executed a violent 180-degree turn. The respect they used to deny me, back when they just saw a harmless old woman tucked away in the back lot, became absolute. My other sons-in-law, the exact same men who had intensely studied their shoelaces while Frank screamed at me on Mother's Day, now walked onto my property with an attitude bordering on comical reverence. Whenever we had family cookouts, they showed up carrying the most expensive cuts of meat from the butcher, unprompted. They would walk through the gate, give me a highly respectful kiss on the cheek, and literally stand waiting until I indicated where they were allowed to sit. Nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, ever tried to sit at the head of the carved wooden table again. That chair was my undisputed throne, and everyone knew exactly what happened to men who tried to usurp it. I hadn't turned into a tyrant. I was still the exact same grandmother who baked butter cookies and kissed the foreheads of my 12 grandchildren. But now that love was reinforced by an invisible, electrified fence of authority that nobody, under any circumstances, dared to touch. Sometimes while standing in the yard watering the deep roots of my oak tree, I paused to think about the bizarre terminal blindness of this society. We live in a culture that worships youth and aggressively buries its elders alive. They think that just because our knees pop when we stand up and our skin starts to feel like parchment paper, we've lost the razor edge of our minds. They look at us and they only see fragility. They completely ignore the fact that the women of my generation didn't grow up asking for permission. We grew up surviving. Every single wrinkle carved into my face is a crisis I navigated. Every dark spot on my hands is an economic disaster I outworked. We learned how to manage absolute poverty and spin it into generational wealth. We learned how to swallow our own grief dry so our kids could drink clean water. Frank's fatal mistake, and the mistake of millions of men exactly like him, was confusing the quiet peace of old age with the submission of a defeated dog. My silence was never a white flag of surrender. It was my war room. Today is Sunday. It's been exactly 6 months since that Mother's Day. The high noon sun is baking the backyard in a rich, golden, forgiving light. The grill is smoking again, but this time it smells like a real family. It smells like reclaimed peace. My 12 grandkids are sprinting across the grass, playing hide and seek around the in-law suite at the back of the lot. I only use that suite as a quiet reading room now because my bed is back in the master bedroom, the beating heart of my house. Laura is in the kitchen. I can see her through the window, pulling a massive, decadent chocolate cake out of the oven using my vintage tin pans. I can hear her laughing. It's a loud, rich, unchained laugh that instantly infects everyone around her. Matt and his uncles are managing the grill, joking around, keeping their voices at a respectful decibel. I loop the straps of my embroidered canvas bag over the back of my wooden chair right at the head of the long table. I pull out my silver transistor radio, set it down on the checkered tablecloth, and dial the volume just right so a smooth, smoky saxophone solo drifts over the clinking of the plates and silverware. I sit down, slowly smoothing the fabric of my floral dress over my knees. I look out over my life's work. I'm not talking about the brick walls or the shingled roof or the corner lot. I'm talking about my family. They were on the verge of rotting away under the thumb of a very small man. And I had to use the scorching heat of my own dignity to burn out the weeds so the soil could finally breathe again. I look down at my wrinkled hands. I look at the swollen knuckles thickened by the brutal labor of thousands of lonely, freezing mornings kneading dough in the dark. These are the hands of Sarah, 72 years old, the absolute master of her own fate and the undisputed owner of the ground beneath her feet. Strong women don't fade away with time. We just stop making noise, waiting for the perfect moment to teach the world a very simple lesson. When the chips are down, the woman who controls the fire will never be afraid of the ashes. Disclaimer: the statement and story discussed below are created purely for educational purposes, designed to inspire personal growth, encourage healthy boundaries, and promote humanistic values that lead to a better life. Listening to Sarah's journey of reclaiming her dignity reminds us that true strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it is the quiet, unwavering resolve cultivated over years of silent sacrifice. We often live in a society that tragically equates aging with fading into the background, stripping our elders of the profound respect they have rightfully earned through decades of resilience. However, this narrative powerfully shatters that illusion, showing us that the patience of a seasoned soul is never a white flag of surrender, but rather a deeply calculated wisdom. It teaches us that setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary surgical move to stop the spread of toxic submission within our families. For those of us working every day to find our voices and speak with unwavering confidence, Sarah's deliberate, unhurried actions serve as the ultimate masterclass in communication. She didn't need to match her son-in-law's frantic shouting to win the battle. Her calm delivery of undeniable truths completely dismantled his fragile ego. This is a vital lesson for all of us. Your authority comes from the weight of your character and the clarity of your words, not the volume of your voice. Furthermore, the story underscores the painful yet beautiful truth that empowering those we love sometimes requires us to let them face the harsh consequences of reality. By refusing to finance a cycle of disrespect, a mother forced her daughter to wake up, ultimately guiding her to discover her own financial and emotional independence through the very skills that built their family. It is a profound reminder that we must never shrink ourselves just so someone else can feel big. True love in a family means demanding respect and breaking generational cycles of cowardice before they infect the youngest minds watching from the sidelines. Every time we excuse terrible behavior in the name of keeping the peace, we are silently betraying our own self-worth. Instead, we must learn to be like the refractory brick in the fire, unbreakable, steadfast, and fully aware of our own immense value. Let this story be the catalyst that encourages you to step into your own power, to articulate your worth without hesitation, and to boldly reclaim the spaces where you have been made to feel small. Ultimately, when you know exactly what your labor, your love, and your life are worth, no one can ever take away the peace you have built with your own two hands.